Right, everyone, welcome to the first panel on the third day of the CEPAD organised conference on international relations in a multipolar Middle East. I'm not sure whether or not people have been to the first few days, or if this is the first panel you're attending. If you've been here for the previous few days, you'll have attended some fantastic panels we've had so far. Talking about a whole range of different topics to do with international relations in a multipolar Middle East, including what was a really fantastic and fascinating keynote address yesterday by Dr. May Darwish. Today, in the seventh panel, we are discussing a really fascinating topic, which is broadly called the rising powers and regional dimensions. But actually what's really exciting about the three panelist presenters that we have here is they're talking about the states that a few years ago perhaps we might not have talked about so much when we discuss the international relations of the Middle East. States like India especially, but also China, Russia as well. That really today in our conversations about Middle Eastern international relations absolutely are becoming a central topic. And it's a real shame that it's a subject that's been underexplored in general. But thankfully we have three panelists today who are doing some really fascinating research on this exact topic. And I'm really looking forward to what they've got to say. General point I'd just like to sort of highlight to everyone, just in case you are joining us for the first time. Your microphone should be muted as part of the process here if you're attending, but just in case it isn't, please do mute it during the presentations. If you have any questions you'd like to direct to the panelists, please feel free to write them down in the Q&A session, either during the presentations or afterwards. What we'll try to do with this 2-hour panel is we'll have about an hour for the presentations and then about an hour for Q&A and discussions afterwards. And like I say, I really feel we're absolutely privileged to have three fantastic presenters speaking. First up, we have Sumitha Kutty, who is from Nanyang Technological University. She'll be presenting a paper on the UAE and India in the Western Indian Ocean, cooperation with elements of competition. Following her, we'll have Guy Burton from Vesalius College. He'll be talking about rising power responses to Middle East conflict, Russia, India, and China in Yemen, Syria, and Libya. And then thirdly, we'll have Muddassir Quamar from Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, and he'll be talking about India and a multipolar Middle East, a silent elephant in the room. Fantastic subtitles there as well, guys. They're all absolutely brilliant. So without further ado then, I'll introduce our first presenter, which is Sumitha. I'll invite her to share screen, come forward, unmute her microphone, and deliver her slideshow. Sumitha, the virtual floor
Right, thank
is
you
yours.
so much, Chris, and thank you, CEPAD. I must say, given the circumstances, it was pretty exciting to see the note about the conference, and it's pretty excited to sign up and actually come on board. I hope everyone can hear me clearly. This is, and everything's all right, and you can see my screen as well. Okay, if, as you notice, the topic in the panel has a question mark, which, you know, when you submit an abstract, you sort of gauge, you don't want to push your hypothesis too strongly. So I kept a question mark, but I've dropped it now in the panel because I'm supposed to say I do think there are elements of competition, potential emerging elements that that are emerging between the UAE and India and the specific sphere of the Western Indian Ocean. All right, now under the shadow, if I could just, I think my presentation, of course, primarily prioritizes, you know, it's coming out of the India-UAE strategic partnership and how vital that is, not just to India, but also the UAE and the region. and therefore my presentation, exploring this very nascent sort of interest in this region and mapping that out. So under the shadow of the Cold War, what you see on your screen is the 1975 India-UAE joint communique issued after the historic visit of the Emirati ruler Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan to New Delhi. And as you can see in here with Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, after which you can see them seated there, where they release this communique where both of them stress the importance of the Indian Ocean being a zone of peace, free from foreign military bases and great power rivalry and tensions. Cut to the 2000, after 2010, this is a CFR graphic from 2013. If you look at the Indian Ocean region, this is just port development slash strategic infrastructure development, logistics facilities, etc. that China, India, and the US are at play here. Clearly, 45 years later, the Indian Ocean region remains a zone of strategic contestation and rivalry, and even after the end of the Cold War, with an even more diverse range of players. You have great powers like the US and France in the region. You have rising powers like China and India, as in this presentation, and exceptional cases of small states like the UAE, with middle power as it's described as having middle power ambitions. That's also present here with its own footprint. Now moving to just a quote from late last year, when the Indian Foreign Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, at a lecture in New Delhi, specifically talking about India's relations with the Gulf, talks about India-UAE beyond just the historical friendships and the strong people-to-people ties. There are approximately 2.5 to 3 million Indians in the UAE alone, about 8 million across the extended Gulf. But he specifically talks about being connected by the Indian Ocean and how India will actively support the UAE in its efforts to promote this shared path to prosperity in the Indian Ocean region. And this is sort of tied to the UAE taking on, becoming the chair of a very important organization, an Indian-initiated organization called IORA, and we'll sort of discuss that later. Given these movements, I think, why does this whole presentation matter, right? It will give a few refreshing insights and new insights into just not just contemporary Gulf India relations, but also the UAE-India relationship. UAE is one of India's, as far as I see, critical strategic partners. After the Quad, which is US, Japan, Australia, or separately France, which is also growingly a close strategic partner in the Indian Ocean, the UAE does come, according to me, is ranked up there. And it's the closest partner in the Gulf and MENA region. Broadly looking at situating this in a changing world order and how states behave in a changing world order, you see the US walking away, China increasingly assertive, definitely India would agree in the last month for sure, and multipolarity, or you have this panel itself and this conference, these keywords, buzzwords, which define our changing world order. And in this changing world order, states are increasingly preferring flexible and limited commitment sort of means to engage with each other. And I think strategic partnerships is one term that states are increasingly using and fond of, given this preference for flexibility. And in short, that means, we talk about alliance systems, yes, but I think India does not do alliances. And in fact, that brings in the idea of alignment a lot more strongly as to how India plays the game and how most of these states look for that flexibility. And I think just in that same bracket, when you talk about flexibility and limited commitment and really no questions of reliability emerging, you have elements of cooperation and competition coexisting in strategic partnerships. And that's where we are in the world today in all relationships, be it India, China, US, China. You have cooperation and then you have elements of competition, one sometimes outgrowing the other as time goes on. And I think this presentation should also give some insight into strategies employed by an ambitious small state like the UAE to further its agenda in this multipolar order, and a rising power, like India, and its approach to accommodate friendly partners in its neighborhood. Very quickly, why the Western Indian Ocean region, its traditional sphere of influence for India, particularly the critical island states in this region that are important to India to offset China's influence, in particular today. The UAE is also finding that the Western Indian Ocean region is a growing strategically significant region and is hugely invested in it. Now, I'm positioned in the Indian strategic community, and and the Indian view or strategic view on the IOR is a geographic scope which does not include the Horn of Africa in a sense. And I specify this because the UAE's strongest footprint is in the Horn of Africa. But those particular states do come in India's Africa strategy. I sort of briefly, I mean, my argument, there's cooperation, but there's also elements of potential competition between them. Okay, so this is how the presentation proceeds. A quick look at snapshot of the strategic partnership, after which a brief look at what the UAE is up to in the Western Indian Ocean region. And this is a new area for me, and sort of discovering the data. It's been pretty fascinating. And then an outlook for how this affects UAE-India ties. And you see certain challenges, some structural challenges as well popping up. So in 2017, you have India and UAE finally signing the strategic partnership agreement. I mean, this word of strategic partnership was already used from 2015, the Modi government coming in 2014, and his first visit in 2015 to the UAE. And just what you've clearly seen in these 5 years is a greater visibility and institutionalization of ties. Modi's visited thrice in 4 years. In 2017, Mohammed bin Zayed, the de facto ruler of the UAE and Crown Prince Abu Dhabi, is the chief guest at India's Republic Day parade. There's also this 140-odd, military contingent of Emirati soldiers who kickstart the parade. So there's a lot of, hectic activity and photo ops and visibility associated with this partnership. You have a strategic dialogue beginning the same year. And then last year, you have a very symbolic moment when Modi receives the Order of Zayed, as you can see there. The second pillar, of course, is growing trade and strategic investments. Bilateral trade in the last year stands at around 50 billion. The target, in fact, was 100 billion by this year. Of course, circumstances have really made it difficult. So this is where we're at now. And today, India is the UAE's second largest trade partner after China. That sort of changed in the last year or so. India was the top trade partner. UAE is India's third largest trade partner after US and China. So third, and what is, I think, the most important pillar here is defense and security and greater a maritime thrust to the whole affair. You have security dialogues that have been established, on defense cooperation, national security councils of both countries frequently talking to each other, and counterterrorism cooperation. Then if you look at exercises and defense diplomacy, there's a bilateral exercise between air forces and more recently the navies. And third, I think maritime security and coastal surveillance is a priority for India in the Indian Ocean region, at large. The scope for maritime domain awareness, improving it, more intelligence and information sharing on what's going on in the waters, whether it's in shipping, etc., is a priority that India has when it looks at this region. And it set up an information fusion center, and it has invited many like-minded countries, including the UAE, to sort of participate. So sort of pause there on the partnership and move into what is the growing footprint of the UAE. Briefly, as I see it, it's sort of hard because there's no one strategic document talking about the Indian Ocean region and the UAE's foreign policy. As I see it, there's a commercial strategy from the literature. I understand it's commercial strategy, investment and foreign aid with an interventionist view, at times military, and a lot more of that happening in the Bab el-Mandab or the Horn of Africa region. Now, just leaving that aside, looking at the commercial strategy, you have a lot of port development through DP World and its subsidiaries. You have renewable energy projects through Masdar, the Abu Dhabi company. And then blue economy is a focus that UAE also assists through funding. That would include ecotourism and transport linkages. Now, briefly coming to what the footprint is like. So as stated earlier, Bab el-Mandab is where the UAE has established itself. Through commercial ports, military agreements, and bases and choke points. You can sort of see it as Socotra, Somalia, Djibouti, and Eritrea. In fact, Assab is where the UAE has its strongest sea lift capability at this point. But as I said, if India does not sort of look at I did mention Djibouti. So India finds Djibouti of interest because, of China's presence since 2014 there is one of the greatest drivers that sort of pushed India also to reassess and renew its engagement in the Western Indian Ocean region. But apart from that, and access to it, India sort of relies or channels it through France and the EU rather than any of the other countries at this point. So second there would be moving on to looking at Emirati engagements across different formats, contributing and assuming leadership positions in multilateral, also India-initiated forums is one way it's doing that. So through the Indian Ocean Rim Association, IORA, as I mentioned, it's the chair now, and its flagship project is setting up a development fund, and it hopes to leave a lasting legacy, as it says. Second is IONS, the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, which is gathering of naval chiefs of these member states. UAE chaired it in 2010, and it's been the IONS has been around since for like 12 years now. And third, not mentioned on the slide, is the UAE giving voice to small island developing states at the UN. It's interesting because the UAE is not a small island developing state, but it talks about bringing to the table specifically renewable energy financing. And I sort of touch upon these themes again because you see them repeating in how the UAE interacts here. Third is prioritizing bilateral engagement with the littoral states, especially the small island states. And looking at those repetitive themes, I come to Maldives and Seychelles because they're two very critical islands in India's IOR strategy. And you see, the UAE deploying all across, infrastructure in Seychelles. It funded the Coast Guard base in 2011, donated a few petrol boats. In the Maldives, it's funding the building of an airport in Mafaru Island. There's also greater, I think, investment and political relationships being built with the Maldives, primarily with the former government, the Yamin government, which also relied a lot on China for its assistance, foreign aid and assistance. Similarly, there's renewables and the blue economy, where Seychelles it's boasts one of the centers of excellence in blue economy. I sort of did this table just to give an idea to look at 2018-19 figures, because you look at what the UAE has. It has a spending power of 48 million, and if you look at what India is also allocated, it's of course it's one data point, but I'm sort of building up the data. But I think there's very comparable amounts given the UAE spending power. So this is where I talk about nascent competition when you have an overlapping area of interest like foreign aid and assistance. Just quickly, a brief overview in relation to what we spoke about the UAE on India's Indo-Pacific approach. One, it's doing in the Western IOR. India is focusing also on building a footprint in the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, apart from the extended region. So you have strengthening coordination with individual governments as well as friendly strategic partners like the US and France, particularly having liaisons in the US Central Command Bahrain, as well as now more recently this news of a liaison at the European Mission Strait of Hormuz, which is set up in January. So that will be at the French naval base in Abu Dhabi. So India is also focused on, as mentioned, improving its Navy's operational reach through logistics agreements and improving MDA. And fourth, India has welcomed growing both Arab and Iranian interest in building an Indian Ocean regional architecture. Now, keeping these in mind, what is changing for India with regard to UAE's movements? So far, UAE's interest is welcome in the IOR as far as even the foreign minister's statement goes. But India will increasingly encounter Emirati footprint. As mentioned regarding Djibouti, and given India using the France or EU route at this point, it's an interesting conversation starter that India could have, but will the UAE be amenable to having conversations over its activities in this part? That brings us to some of the significant structural constraints to seamless cooperation. One is the China challenge. India and UAE have very different threat perceptions. For India today, it's an immediate challenge. There's been a fundamental shift in the relationship that India and China have with the recent clashes. So it's how Delhi proceeds to introduce this into its strategic circles would need to be seen now. And the IOR is a primary strategic theater for India to offset China's influence. And so this may change for the UAE, and we could anticipate in discussions which revolve the Horn of Africa, even though, for India, it's a Southeast Asian and South Asian neighborhoods that are more of a priority. Second, I think it would be interesting to see, does UAE's understanding of China evolve at all? It's a bit hard to read this, given we have limited data on perceptions, especially leadership perceptions in the Gulf on China. But the UAE still remains hesitant. As I said, the threat perception is very different. China is still an economic player, a geo-economic player. The second part, just quickly, I know I'm running out of time, but just quickly, is pursuing IORA ION's reform. This is a call in New Delhi when China's presence increasing the region. These are organizations which function on consensus, and it's a mixed group of states, and it's really hard to actually think of reform, even though there are calls for it. Third is, something that's unfolding right now, and that's the impact that COVID-19 has on foreign aid and assistance policies. You have an economic downturn, collapse in oil prices, India, across the board, it's a bleak scene. And, can all these countries keep up with their aid strategies, recalibrate them? All of that comes into play now. And I think finally, the case study, as I said, of Maldives and Seychelles sort of shows when you have overlapping interests, and they're funding strategic infrastructure development with political diplomatic aims. That if the two meet, they meet as friends. Domestic politics plays an important role here. Different governments have treated both India and the UAE differently. So this is something to definitely look for, watch out and observe. So just wrapping up, elements of cooperation and competition coexist today in a changing world order, just like in the case of these close partners, a small ambitious state like the UAE and a rising power like India. The strategic opportunity here would be, to share India's concerns, and keep the conversation over the region going, not just in economic terms, but also geopolitical, because that's exactly the viability of a strategic partnership. One can listen and not necessarily have to agree with everything, but, assist in some other ways that are favorable. I'll stop there. And we can go to the questions.
Thank you, Sumitha. That's fantastic. I think actually what we're going to do is we're going to have all the questions at the end. So we'll have all the panelists and then a block of questions at the end. But that was an absolutely fascinating presentation. I was frantically scribbling notes down on my phone there. So there's lots of questions I've got, let alone from the audience. But we'll move straight on then to Guy's presentation. Guy, I'd like to invite you to take control. And Sumitha, if you could mute your mic, and I will let Guy take control of the deck. Over to you, Guy.
Thank you very much, Chris, and also thank you to SEPAD for organising this event, and also particularly the opportunity to have a chance to talk about rising powers. So I in the 15 minutes that I have, I realize there's an awful lot to get through, so I probably won't be able to sort of go into any kind of sort of fine-grained detail about, sort of each of these individual countries' relationships towards, sort of the conflicts in Libya, Syria, and Yemen. But what I want to maybe do is sort of draw out some sort of general sort of themes and developments that I think are happening there, and move forward, and as a sort of a basis for thinking about sort of how we might work on this into the future. So the way that I wanted to, the way I've sort of structured today is to talk a little bit about, well, what are rising powers and what they do. And I think this will provide some sort of context and framework for being able to make sense of these three countries, these three external powers that we're looking at, Russia, India, and China, and what they're doing in what I call the hot conflicts of the Middle East, Syria, Yemen, and Libya. I mean, effectively, it's about 9 relationships going on there, sort of 3 and 3. And from that, then I want to sort of draw out some sort of key points of features and lessons we can draw, both from this particular case, as well as sort of, for, elements of moving forward in terms of future research. So, I mean, how might we think about, so what are rising powers? And this is where I think, it's useful to sort of, frame it a little bit. I mean, rising powers, emerging powers, these are terms that have been sort of used quite regularly over the last, a decade or so. Certainly, and if we want to go further back to, I think, sort of the emergence of a group like the BRICS, which is what's brought me to this kind of work in the first place. this idea, there is an interesting thing that these rising powers do seem to sort of be, somewhat different to sort of traditional understandings of emerging or rising powers. There's often some overlap between rising powers and middle powers. If you look in the literature looking at in relation to things like middle powers, them often being sort of traditional sort of Western powers like Australia and Canada, which provided sort of backup and support to the liberal world order, especially during the Cold War. Also, it's important to keep in mind sort of the context in which these rising powers are emerging. We do talk a lot about multipolarity, and certainly, both the region as well as the globe is becoming more multipolar, but it's not a pure multipolarity yet. It's still one in which the United States is a dominant, almost hegemonic force, despite its economic and military retreats post the financial crisis of 2008-9, and also its inability to be able to win wars, as in the occupation of Iraq after 2003. So the Americans are still a presence, and that is obviously a key, and the American presence is still something by which these emerging and rising powers, sort of measure themselves against. Now, in terms of sort of defining rising powers, I mean, in the literature, there's broadly about 3 ways that you can do this. One is, the first is to look at them in terms of, objectively, is there a sort of a measurable standard by which we can look at rising powers? Then sort of subjectively, if this is how they're perceived, or if they are recognized as such. And finally, in terms of behavior, and behavior is the one I'm going to be using today. But in terms of just sort of saying very briefly about objective, this you can sort of do in terms of sort of looking at their economic position, their demographic position, the amount they spend on their military. So very much sort of material ways of defining rising powers, whereas subjective ones tend to be those of, in terms of, do we recognize these states as such, as being rising powers. In terms of behavior, broadly, there's about 4 ways that you can think about the way that they behave. Generally, as I just sort of alluded to, sort of the traditional Western ones of Canada and Australia, they were effectively supporters of the international system that emerged after 1945. What you find in the literature is sort of this idea of, supporters, but then on the other hand, spoilers, especially these rising powers associated with the global South, with states that are sort of maybe not on the same position or wavelength, but as Western powers. And certainly that is the way that the BRICS were perceived, at least in the first decade of the current century. They were sort of seen as challengers or spoilers of the international system. There's been a bit of but from that sort of dichotomy of supporters versus spoilers, there's been sort of an effort to sort of try and to develop further the ways that we might think about rising powers. And some have also suggested that they can play a shirker role, i.e., they try to sort of opt out of the system, or not play an active role in trying to challenge it or to support it, but really to sort of to take a step back. And then there's those that might say, and to this one might add, well, that they can play a shaping role in terms of sort of trying to create a new system rather than sort of just constantly challenging it. So I find this quite a useful sort of framework for thinking about how Russia, India, and China would be perceived in relation to these conflicts in the Middle East and the Middle East more generally. Now, in terms of thinking about, sorry, I should just go back. In terms of thinking about the conflicts themselves and where they sit in terms of these 3 states' strategic thinking, it's important to first of all recognize that the Middle East is a region of secondary importance and concern for all 3. Their primary objectives are not necessarily about a hegemony and dominance in the Middle East. The Middle East is used more as a region to support their search for a greater influence in the world, but it's not essential. It's not primary, and I think that is also useful for sort of keeping in mind the ways that these 3 countries have responded. Now, in the time that I have available, I think I'm going to just rattle very quickly through effectively about 7 main points that I draw from comparing these countries' interactions with the conflicts themselves. Like I said, it would be there's far too much detail to be able to complete in 15 minutes, but I do hope with the opportunity to be able to develop a paper out of this, that I might be able to go into more detail about that. I'm more than happy to share that with people when that happens. So the first thing to say is that what really, the point at which I'm looking at is really from 2011 onwards. So from the start of the uprisings and what has happened since. Now, what is interesting is quite a bit of the literature focuses on the period around 2011, especially for these countries, and particularly for India, because after 2011, the Indian involvement seems to sort of dissipate somewhat, whereas that between Russia and China continues. Now, what's interesting is to keep in mind that all three of these countries, the BRICS actually as a whole, were all members of the UN Security Council in 2011 when the uprisings first started. And all of them were taken by surprise by Resolution 1973 in Libya, which authorized a no-fly zone. You know, the Russians and Chinese effectively abstaining on as permanent members, abstaining on that vote. The other BRICS countries either voting for it or abstaining. What they were surprised by was the Western interpretation and the use of NATO forces to prevent Gaddafi's forces in the air. In a way, that had a consequence for subsequent uprisings and subsequent developments, because they vowed that they would not be sort of taken by surprise again. So what you find in Syria is a very divided international community. From the outset, the West has tended to sort of caricature the Chinese and Russians on one side and the West on the other, and the Chinese and Russians being somewhat obstructive. Although actually, if you look at it, it's a little bit more nuanced than that. So moving from sort of the first point that I say about sort of, you know, them being overtaken by the no-fly zone in Libya, there's a second point, which I think sort of for the first few years after 2011, Syria takes, you know, takes much of the focus in terms of sort of the conflicts. And there is this sort of sense that, at least from the West, that these countries have prioritized national sovereignty over humanitarian issues and concerns. You see that in sort of the Russian and Chinese vetoes over Syria in 2011-12, Russia's partnership with Syria, you know, especially after 2015, and also Chinese and Indian acceptance of the Russian presence in Syria. That brings me to the third point, which is that of you know, the distinction that the Chinese and Indians make in terms of Russia's presence in Syria after 2015. They distinguish between, on the one hand, the Russians being there by the invitation of the Syrian government, whereas the American presence, which is there also to combat the terrorist threat of ISIS, they critique on the basis that they were not invited by the regime. So they sort of place this importance upon sovereignty, but also they distinguish as well between sort of, you know, intervention which is invited versus intervention which is Western. Also, to that idea of non-Western intervention, you find that they're quite quiet and circumspect when it comes to regional intervention in the conflicts taking place there. So you don't find them saying very much about the Saudi-led coalition's intervention into Yemen, especially after 2015. Another point to raise here is that of structural constraints. Throughout, I mean, as I mentioned, you know, you have all of three of these countries on the Security Council in 2011. But what is interesting is that after 2011, or rather after 2012, India ceases to be a temporary member and comes off the Security Council, at which point it becomes harder to discern what their position is in relation to many of these conflicts. Obviously, the Russians and Chinese still continue to be permanent members and so still have a say in what happens in relation to these conflicts, at least sort of at the international level. So what we find is that there is a structural difference in terms of the way that the international system is set up that makes Indian influence much more ephemeral than that of the Russians and Chinese. Also we find as well that there's a focus on evacuation by the Indians and Chinese, both in the conflict in Libya and Yemen in its early stages. A lot of, you know, ink is spilt, focusing on how coordinated and effective their evacuations were of their nationals as well as foreign nationals. Whereas by contrast, a lot more of the attention, especially after 2015, is given to Russia's intervention in Syria and its attempt to try and leverage that influence into the other conflicts taking place in the Middle East. That brings me to this sort of broad summary of where we can sort of place these countries. Broadly, all of them are starting from a fairly low base in 2011, but by 2020, one would argue that that Russia has perhaps made the most advances in terms of, leveraging its influence in Syria into a potential diplomatic actor and mediator in Libya and Yemen. Certainly in Libya, there's been a lot of attention given to Russian backing to General Haftar, but also they have tried to keep the door open to talking to the GNA on the other side. Similarly, they've also tried to do the same thing in Yemen. So that actually sort of poses a question, because often from Western capitals, Russia is portrayed as a spoiler. But interestingly enough, in this kind of telling, it suggests that the Russians see themselves in a much more engaged, a much more constructive role as a shaper. Of the other two, India, obviously, as I pointed out, has the least influence here. It's more of a reactive role, especially after it leaves the Security Council. The Chinese are an interesting case because they've effectively avoided any kind of direct involvement in the conflicts as a mediator themselves, but they have potentially the greatest influence here. Their influence is effectively based on the fact that they are the second largest economy in the world today, but also the fact that countries like Syria and outside of my particular focus, Iran, are using their relationship with China to try and portray themselves as, an attractive place for investment, as an alternative to the West. So I think actually of those three, Russia's probably done most with its limited base, but the Chinese have a potential influence there which they haven't exercised. And for that reason, I would argue that the Chinese and the Indians occupy the space of a shirker more than that of a spoiler. Whereas Russia is perhaps more about that of a shaper. Now, I mean, I had just this little sort of video that I tried to put together that illustrates, since 1990, the sort of relative size of GDP for these three countries, which you can see in the circle. And you can see broadly that they start off in a broadly similar size in 1990, but by effectively today, we are seeing that the Chinese are proportionately significantly greater than that of the other two. So finally, just to sort of say, where does this take us? I think what this points to is, we need to sort of maybe rethink some of the perceptions and ideas that we have about what are, what is the behavior of rising powers. Certainly Western capitals have portrayed the Russians as challengers, as spoilers, the Chinese to some extent. I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that. And I think this is why it's important that we try and open up the voices, open up the discussion, open up the analysis that's going on here, because otherwise we end up with too limited a perspective from places like Washington, London, and Brussels. In terms of sort of where does this, where do we go beyond this? This is an area of work that I'm interested in, and I'm sort of developing further. Obviously, India, I think perhaps has a stronger relationship to the Gulf than these conflict zones itself. But it does pose the question for looking at these countries, other rising powers, whether it's from outside the country, outside the region, or within the region, in a much broader sense. I also think this kind of comparative work helps us draw out these distinctions that exist between them. And finally, I also think it's important to try and sort of provide some kind of long-term, broader historical perspective to this. I mean, as my presentation has shown, it's really only been since 2011 that I've been looking at, but I think it would also make sense to sort of situate this, in the position of these countries' relationships to the region from a much more historical context. So if you go back and draw in the Cold War, for example, you've got the Soviet-Chinese conflict that plays itself out in the Middle East. Similarly, India's pursuit of non-alignment obviously has been, challenged by that, and its growing closeness to the United States, especially since 2005, I think makes for, a significant feature that's taking place in all of this. So certainly, I think, moving forward, I guess the appeal I make is that we do more of this kind of work. Thank you.
Okay, wow, thanks very much. That was really, really interesting stuff once again. And again, I've been making lots of notes and have loads of questions, especially given my interest in Syria and Russia, India and China's interest in that particular conflict. But perhaps we can discuss that in the Q&A or at a later date. I'll move straight on then to our third presenter, Muddassir, again looking at the Indian involvement in the region. I will hand over to you virtually, Muddassir, if you want to take control of the deck. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chris. I hope I'm audible enough. I'll just share my presentation. Yeah, so first of all, thanks, Chris, and thanks the CEPAD for having me here. And I'm really happy to be part of this fascinating panel after two very good presentations. So what I thought, and you know, as Chris mentioned in the introduction, that usually when we talk about the Middle East, the development in the Middle East, it's very rare that you talk about rising powers, and specifically with regard to India, because, you know, I mean, it's not entirely kind of you know, not completely out of the place, because really India doesn't has you know, been very vocal about developments in the region, or it has not really been trying to kind of influence or be actively involved in the developments in the region. And that's why the subtitle, as you know, the silent elephant in the room, because if you look at the situation in the last 5 years, you know, India has been very actively involved in terms of bilateral engagements and has tried to keep away from any kind of conflicts to try and balance its relations with each and every important, you know, regional players and even smaller countries in terms of the, you know, regional situation. So what I thought is try and raise this question as to, as the situation in the Middle East starts to change, as we are looking at, you know, very fast-paced developments, transition. There is also, you know, developments in terms of global geopolitics affecting the regional situation. Can India actually maintain this kind of an engagement where it remains more or less detached, but it continues to kind of very extensively engage bilaterally with important countries in the region? So apart, I mean, I thought maybe just a bit of in terms of background, a bit of history would help in terms of how I would try and look at it from more from Indian foreign policy point of view. If you look at it post-independence, I mean, I'm not talking about British India, which was very extensively involved in the politics in Gulf, but if you look at post-independence, India wasn't really very kind of involved in the regional politics, or it was more inward-looking, except maybe in the early stages of you know, Prime Minister Nehru's time, when you had the building of solidarity on the basis of anti-imperialism or anti-colonialism, or the idea of non-alignment. Beyond that, India didn't really play a very kind of major role in the global politics, and there were a number of variety of factors for that. But this starts to change in post-Cold War situation, and that is where one also sees that India kind of starts to reach out to the Gulf countries, mainly terms it as its extended neighborhood, you know, talks about civilizational links, and tries to kind of build on the commercial relationships, mainly to kind of address its own, you know, energy security related issues. And from there on, one sees that, you know, a lot of it is being built in terms of how you know, bilateral relations kind of move forward. And if you look at it in the last 5 years or so, things have really extensively changed in terms of, you know, political and diplomatic engagements. For example, you know, you have, as Sumitha was talking about in terms of India-UAE relations, you see a number of very high-profile visits, a lot of, you know, very spectacle in terms of visits by the by Prime Minister Modi to the UAE, or visit by Mohammed bin Zayed of the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi to India, twice in the last 5-6 years. And then from there on, other countries also kind of the same pattern is repeated. What I argue here is that, I mean, apart from UAE, if you look at other countries with which India has really built very good relationship in the region, is Saudi Arabia and to Israel as well. So these are the three countries in the region with which India has really built very strong political, diplomatic linkages. They have extensive trade, even though, I mean, when it comes to Israel, the trade is not, the numbers are not very high, but it is one of the, one of the top suppliers of defense equipments and weapons to India, maybe among top 2 or 3. So that is also something which is noticeable. The only other countries, and even with Saudi Arabia, one sees that it's the 4th largest trading partner. There has been extensive engagement there. Has been a lot of diplomatic talks between Prime Minister, even though the visits have only been just one visit of Prime Minister Modi and then Crown Prince coming to India. But at every G20 meeting, you see that Prime Minister Modi and Crown Prince, have been talking to each other, and there have been a lot of conversation in terms of at the diplomatic level, at the level of foreign ministers, foreign secretary of India, and all that. So, I mean, the only other country with which perhaps one could have saw a similar pattern was Iran. But then currently, given the kind of tensions between US and Iran, I would say that the relation have a little bit gone in the background, because of the mainly, I would say, US factor. And then there was also a time when Oman was considered to be very close in terms of India's foreign policy in the Gulf. But again, I think when it comes to the regional dynamics, the changing regional dynamics, the emergence of the Riyadh-Abu Dhabi axis in the Gulf and the larger Middle East, I think that has also been a bit neglected as far as India is concerned. Now, having said that, if one looks at the current situation, I mean, there's a lot of engagement, as I mentioned, but there are 2 major points which I feel are important as far as in trying to, if one tries to understand as to why exactly India is doing this. There are 2 major issues. One is India is completely focused on trying to use its political and diplomatic relations to develop or to grow its own economy, which has been growing, but it wants to kind of expedite that process of growth, economic growth, so that it can actually, focus on its own population, which is obviously one of the largest population in the world, and that is something which has been in the mind to try and attract investments, to try and build partnerships with the Gulf countries, so that in any areas where they can focus and kind of invest in India, that can be done. The other thing is building security and counterterrorism kind of partnerships with each and every countries. And if you look at all the joint statements, all kind of talks during visits of the leaders of these countries to India, or Indian leadership's visit to these countries, this counterterrorism partnerships comes up very prominently in the joint statement and discussion. So that is something which becomes very important. And I mean, the kind of extensive engagement, if you look at it, I mean, if you go back in 2018, within the span of 40 days, India hosted Benjamin Netanyahu, and then the Iranian President Hassan Rouhani, and then King Abdullah II of Jordan. And then earlier you had Erdogan coming, even though right now India and Turkey have not really been kind of looking very much eye to eye due to a number of factors. And obviously other leaders have also been coming to India, and Indian leaders have been going to these countries. Now, when it comes to economic engagement, I thought it would be important to highlight that these are the most important factors. You have energy imports to India. You have very good bilateral trade. If you look at it, the Gulf as a bloc is one of the largest. Almost 15% of India's foreign trade is conducted with the Gulf countries. And then you have Indian exports, even though in terms of when compared to the balance of trade, India is in not really, except in the case of UAE, India is in negative. But then these are also areas from which India exports a lot when it comes to its foreign trade. And then obviously I talked about the FDI and Indian businesses in the region, and then obviously the 10 million, even though officially the number is around 8 million or 8.9 million. When you talk to people who have surveyed the pattern of migration, it is much larger, and almost 40 billion in remittances which India received last year or in the last few years annually. Obviously, with the current COVID-19 situation, it might be affected, but then once the economies kind of go back to normal, things will again go back to the same situation. I thought maybe I'll add a few kind of figures and data here just to give you an idea about energy imports and all that. Similarly, in terms of, if you look at the share, almost 60 to 65% in terms of hydrocarbon imports to India comes from the Gulf countries. This is about the FDI since January 2000 to December 2019. UAE is among the top 10, and then you have other countries from the Gulf who are, either within 50 or slightly Qatar and Kuwait a little lesser. This is the number of Indians in the Gulf, but again, the number in bracket shows the annual increase or decrease in 2019. Again, this will be affected in 2020. And when it comes to counter-terrorism related issues. So these are the things which are important. As Sumitha was talking about, the Western Indian Ocean is really important as far as India's strategic thinking is concerned. And there are elements of obviously, competition and cooperation with all the important countries, including UAE, and to some extent even Saudi Arabia as well, which is very interested in the Red Sea area, even though India hasn't really officially reacted to it, but then that will also be something of interest to India. Now, we all know we have been discussing the issues related to the changing regional dynamics. So I'll skip this part and come directly to the question. As to what end? I mean, all these things to what end? What exactly it leads to? There are lots of suggestions and arguments in India. For example, people have talked about India should try and lower tensions because it is an interest of India. They've also been talking about India developing partnership with the great powers or regional powers, emerging powers, to try and lower tensions in the region, especially when it comes to Saudi-Iran tensions or intra-Gulf tensions or US-Iran tensions, and there are other issues as well. And then there have also been some discussion within New Delhi strategic circles about, India, since it has built ties with the leaders, it can leverage that to try and counsel them to reduce the tension at the level. But I mean, this is where I think it's important to understand everything said and done. It's from the Indian point of view, if one looks at it, there are a number of pros and cons. I mean, if India wants to engage a little more with the region, it has very strong partnerships, it has soft power, it has vital interest, stable region is in India's interest. India doesn't have any baggage in terms of there are countries with a lot of baggage, so that is also something which is important as far as India is concerned. These are the pluses, but then there are a lot of minuses. And I think that is also very important to understand that India already has very limited resources to spare. If it really wants to go and engage in the region, it hardly has any influence. As Guy was saying, I mean, there is hardly any influence for India to actually leverage it. And then when it comes to really getting involved in the region, you need a strong military. India doesn't really have, I mean, it has one of the largest standing militaries. All that is good. But when it comes to strength on the ground, India's military modernization is in a very early stages, I would say. And then you do not also really have any immediate security threats with which India has to deal with in the region, and it has a lot to take care of in its own immediate surroundings. You have China, as we have seen the flaring up of in the Himalayas, and then you have the South Asian region itself has its share of problems. So those are the things which India is more kind of interested in or more involved in. India also doesn't really has any experience in terms of going out and doing something. At best, Indian forces have joined UN peacekeeping forces. And then these conflicts in the region or the problems in the region are much protracted. And to be very fair, it would be very difficult. I mean, all kinds of efforts have hardly really helped in terms of, yes. Also, in terms of if you look at in terms of the appetite for India to be part of, to have greater involvement in the region, it doesn't really has that kind of appetite. If you talk to people in New Delhi, in the strategic circles, they don't really have that kind of an inclination. Also, in terms of direct stakes, it hardly has anything. So India, as Guy was also saying, India has been more reactive and very quiet in terms of how to react, except in case of Syria and recently in case of Libya. It has issued statements. It doesn't really has said much. And also, when you look at how India has negotiated, if faced with any problem, it has tried to repatriate if there is a safety issue. Even going back to Kuwait crisis or the recent issues in Yemen and Libya, and even in Egypt, India did some repatriation of its nationals. And then if you look at the issue regarding the energy security, India has tried to diversify both its energy sources as well as the sources from which it imports hydrocarbons. So in the last year, US has become the 5th largest exporter of energy to India. Now, I'll just sum up here and maybe kind of leave the other things to question answer session. I mean, yeah, eventually maybe one can see that it becomes inevitable for India as it grows, as it becomes, or it joins a certain kind of, there were discussion about whether India will become part of becoming closer to the United States. A lot will depend on how the international politics pans out and so on and so forth. But right now, if you look at it, in my understanding, we will see a continuation of the same pattern as we are seeing. That India will try to extensively engage with regional countries with which it has vital interest, and try to keep out of any kind of regional problems that it might think will hamper its relation, and keep balancing its acts as far as the regional powers is concerned. I'll stop here and leave it other things to the question.
That was absolutely fantastic, Muddassir. Thank you so much. And actually, what's fantastic about all three of these papers is how much they really complement one another, and how much they're really kind of, there's so many areas of overlap in all three of your works that you presented today about this question of, obviously, sort of Sumitha and Muddassir, you're both focusing on India. Guy, you're bringing in China and Russia as well. But many of the themes that you're talking about, quite neatly encapsulated in that diagram that Guy put up, in the sort of like, actually what role should these actors be playing in the Middle East? What do they want to, what role do they envisage for themselves? What role do the regional players envisage for them? And obviously you get a really fascinating dynamic that you were talking about just then, Muddassir, about how much are the leadership trying to project Indian presence into the region? How much are regional powers like Sumitha was talking about, the UAE, wanting and India to come in, or alternatively, do they see them as a rival? I mean, it's a really fascinating dynamic, and like I said at the top of the presentation, one that really is underexplored. I'm going to use my position as a chair a little bit just to sort of throw a thought into the equation, perhaps for you to consider alongside some of the questions that we've already got coming in. And that's the idea that I wonder, sort of, though Guy did talk about China, it's an interesting contrast, the role in the region of Russia and India as a contrast point, because of course their starting points are quite different. In living memory, you have bureaucrats and military leaders and political leaders in Russia who remember Russia being this global power that did have an active footprint in the Middle East, whereas you don't have that in India. That it's a relatively new position as a global power, even though obviously has historically in the more distant past had a regional footprint in the Gulf and so on, but that sort of superpower role isn't familiar to that generation of Indian leaders in the way that it will have been for some Russian leaders. And I wonder how those dynamics contrast quite interestingly. That's just something to sort of think about that struck me as you were all talking. But I'm going to jump into the Q&A, and we've already got some fascinating questions coming in, and I'd strongly urge our audience to jump in with further questions. We'll try, we've got plenty of time. We've still got another hour to go. So please do jump in with questions in the Q&A box. And we've already got several points coming in. I'm actually going to immediately leap on one that Fatima Kalut has just put in. Where she said the primacy of, this is a question for all the panelists, by the way, she says the primacy of development and multilateralism are two legacies that used to condition Brazilian foreign policy. Again, an interesting sort of further BRICS power involved. Brazil is losing space as a regional power in South America, mainly after the election of 2018 that brought Bolsonaro to power. The crucial reason for this are political and ideological divides. Do you perceive Brazil in the BRICS context? And can it still be considered alongside China, India, and Russia and South Africa as an emerging power? I suppose within sort of your studies of India and Russia and China's involvement in the Middle East, whether or not you can, what role you see for Brazil within that. So that's one question for you all to think about. Another one that I will just throw in as well, because I put it into the wrong column by mistake, which is one from Jasmine Ghani, which is specifically for Muddassir. And she says, thanks to all the panelists, specifically talking to Muddassir about India's foreign policies and partnerships in the Middle East, and asking whether or not they have their own, their own local tensions. So in particular, she says, does the close relationship with Israel regarding counter-terror cooperation feed back into the current Indian government's approach towards minorities and increased right-wing nationalism? And I suppose actually in many ways that question could also be addressed to both Sumitha and to Guy with regard to India's involvement, because I mean, I'm very conscious of India's perhaps slightly more sympathetic view to Bashar al-Assad in Syria is very, very much from a counter-terrorist, anti-Islamist perspective, and I wonder whether or not its alignment with the UAE is similarly related to MBZ's very critical stance on Islamists. As well as what you might find elsewhere in the region. So several questions to deal with. I don't know who would like to answer first. You guys, perhaps we'll go in order. So Sumitha, if you'd like to pick up on any of those points, feel free to address those that you want to, and pass the buck on to the others if there's any you'd rather focus on more than others. Thanks very much.
Right, I'm just trying to reread Jasmine's question. What bring this? Because does the UAE, yes, of course, I mean, the MBZ is Islamist, I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood, anti-Muslim Brotherhood attitudes, I mean, the way Emirati foreign policy has specifically designed itself, positioned itself against certain elements among these groups, does not really reflect as much when it comes to its discussions within this bracket when we talk about counterterrorism, the Indian scenario. Just a little bit of a history, even 12 years ago, it was 2008, the Mumbai terror attacks, and you had a couple of the Lashkar-e-Taiba, Pakistan nurtured, sponsored organization, does this attack, and there's been this oft-repeated history where these suspects are in the Saudi Arabia or in the Gulf region, and India unable to sort of negotiate or fight for its case and get these people either get these people, full stop. And that sort of changed from after, in 2006, India signs, also starts engaging with the Saudis a lot, with King Abdullah's visit in particular. So there's a lot of, one important point which I think needs to always be emphasized is that things have changed in the Middle East as well from the 2000s and how it viewed India. And it sort of ties into some of those other questions that popped up. So I was thinking about it in the same frame, and how the Saudis and the Emiratis viewed India change, and how it could be this not just an economic power or an investment destination, but also to help it in certain other political goals, including countering certain terrorist elements and groups. So you see after Mumbai attacks this shift where, unprecedented in 2011, the Saudis sent back, they capture one of these LET guys, and they repeated such instances which were never done before. And so in that sense, that's where the counterterrorism cooperation element sort of kicks up a notch. Then with the Islamic State also coming in, because you not only have Indians in the Gulf who sort of use social media, etc., and it could be just as minor as that, or actually part of certain bigger ideas and plots, etc. So you have this trajectory in counterterrorism that would be tied to working together on against, I would say, terrorism. I think just making it Islamist groups sort of is a bit more complex when you look at how the region, the Middle East, looks at these groups. So so for India, it's not really about specific, because they align regarding certain groups, but that India's own interest with these Pakistan-sponsored, funded groups, it comes first, and that's where that's. On Brazil, it's pretty much, I haven't gone looking at what Brazil's been up to, so I don't have any specific things, but I do know Guy certainly has, I think he would totally be able to contribute on this. So I guess if there is no other particular question at this point, just these two, I think
that's great. That's great, Sumitha. Thanks. Yes, Guy is chomping at the bit to talk about Brazil. He has Latin American pedigree here, so I'll invite him to come in on that point and any others he wants to discuss.
Thank you. Actually, can I just maybe I could wrap that up with your question, Chris, as well as Francesco's and Simon's, about the idea of middle and rising powers more generally. And I think, just to put this, because there are some questions about nature of definition, is it appropriate to use the term rising power? I mean, Chris, to the point you say about doesn't Russia seem to be the odd one out here? Because, at least until Fatima's question about Brazil, I mean, at least, much of the thinking was that, the BRICS were really the rising powers, the emerging powers from the South. And of course, Russia wasn't. Russia was a returning power rather than a rising one. This also brings me to the bigger question of how do we define these? I mean, is rising power the most appropriate term to use? Or, if we look back historically, I mean, the idea of middle power started to emerge, in the wake of the Second World War, and it was really to deal with these kind of countries which were obviously not great powers. They weren't able to to push the global envelope of the agenda, by themselves. So it became synonymous with the ideas of multilateral cooperation, working on secondary issues like the Australians and the Canadians. But also those countries were very much identified with the West. And then what you have in the 1950s and 60s with decolonization is the emergence of all these other states. So how do we make sense of that? How do we define those? And I think initially the thinking is to try and do this objectively, right? So it's measuring them, trying to set, measure them by economic weight or population size, or the size of their arsenals. What you then have is a shift from that kind of objective approach, which I think is characterized by by a book that was put out by Holbrand in 1984. Into the 1990s, with the emergence of constructivism, you have this alternative approach, which is that, look, you cannot be you cannot be a middle power or a great power. On the one hand, to be a great power, you might think you are, but it's important that others think you are as well. right? So, I mean, Hurrell says this in 2000, TV Paul says this more recently. He talks about status and the importance of status, you know, being what states are looking for. You know, they want to sort of be seen as, you know, high profile, bigger than they are. And so there's that sort of subjective element there, which is, so really sort of middle/rising powers kind of is basically that in between. And I don't think we're ever going to really sort of nail it down, because some have said maybe rising powers is synonymous with regional powerdom. But if you are a regional power, you know, yes, then would you say that the UAE is equivalent to, you know, to India? I mean, the UAE is not necessarily projecting itself, you know, beyond its own region, whereas, you know, countries like, you know, Russia and India are to some extent extra regional. So there is this kind of ambiguity, which I don't know if it's particularly problematic. I mean, I think, you know, as long as we're sort of clear about what the term is that we're using, and then that's fine. I think also, just to sort of say more specifically on the question of Brazil, yes, I mean, you know, this is where I think, you know, the objective as well as the subjective dimensions become important here, because, you know, Brazil's influence has obviously retreated with its economic capacity or its economic weakness over the last decade, and that has been perceived as well. So it is, you know, whereas, you know, sort of back in 2014, it was very much sort of at the forefront of, you know, of leading the BRICS at the Fortaleza summit. That's really sort of where BRICS starts to get institutionalized with the new development black bank, the contingent reserve account. You know, Brazil's playing an active role there, but it has been on the retreat. And I mean, even then it was probably on the retreat, because a lot of sort of Brazilian sort of great, you know, rising powerness was associated with, you know, the Lula presidency, which also was synonymous with the economic boom of the commodity boom of the 2000s. And what we have with Dilma, his successor from 2011 to 2016, there was an interesting moment where Brazil was, you know, playing an active role in sort of interpreting what responsibility to project meant in the context of Libya and Syria. And there was an interesting engagement where they were talking about shifting that away from responsibility to protect to responsibility while protecting. But then there wasn't really sort of the enthusiasm, the impetus from Dilma herself to pursue that. And what you find really is kind of, along with the economic decline, and obviously sort of the political chaos that's happened with, you know, after her impeachment, you know, there's not really been sort of a sustained effort by the Brazilians to sort of recapture that, or even to sort of be particularly influential in the Middle East.
Thanks, Guy. Muddassir, do you want to come in on any of the questions we've raised thus far?
Oh yes, yeah. There was a specific question regarding the you know, the issue of minorities in India, and, you know, the local tensions, and how, you know, India's growing strategic ties with Israel, how that kind of impacts. I mean, these are very important points. I mean, what we are actually questioning is whether the foreign policy actually impacts the domestic issues as well. I mean, to be very fair, I'm yet to see actually in a situation where foreign policy be completely, you know, kind of influencing something happening within the country, within the domestic politics. Yeah, the other way around certainly has happened. I mean, there has been a lot of scholarship discussing how the Muslim factor in India led to India not recognizing Israel for a long time, or not establishing, I mean, recognition had come, but not establishing diplomatic ties with Israel until 1992. And then, you know, there are also discussions regarding how India's domestic politics shaped India's relations with the Gulf countries before the Cold War. I mean, before the end of the Cold War, during the Cold War, how that led to India not really growing closer ties with the Gulf monarchies. But in terms of the current debate on how there has been some discussions within the Gulf countries, within the Middle East, within, you know, social media and in the Arab press about atrocities on minorities in India, or some of the issues regarding rights happening in Delhi, for example, in the early this year. These are issues which are very relevant, which are very in terms of, if you look at the domestic fault lines in India, this is not something new. This has been happening for quite some time, and for most of the times, the governments have tried to manage the situation from within, and it doesn't really, in terms of foreign policy, can't really kind of impact how the government, treats, or what kind of, policies the government kind of, adopts as far as minorities are concerned. These are very important discussions which has been going on in India for quite some time also. There's been a lot of criticism in terms of how the government has handled issues related to atrocities on minorities and all that. But I would also kind of point to the fact that these have not really very significantly led to any impact on bilateral relations with countries in the Gulf, even though there have been some criticism coming from Turkey, for example, talking about the Kashmir issue at the United Nations, President Erdogan taking up the issue. There have been some discussion, debate, and debates at the OIC level. But then India has been kind of trying to say that these are internal matters, and these countries do not have any kind of a local standard on internal issues in India. So these are, I think, part of the process in terms of how India's relations evolve and where India actually wants itself to be seen in terms of the global politics. And a lot of these things will obviously be important when it comes to discussing these issues. Then there were a few, I thought maybe I can also comment on a few questions which were asked regarding the human rights issues affecting the Indian migrants in Gulf, specifically in UAE, and not just UAE, even in other Gulf countries. This is again an issue which is extensively discussed in civil society in India, within India. You get a lot of press coverage of any incident whereby you find that a migrant, an Indian migrant has, or even other migrants are treated, or the kind of the issue related to the kafala system, the sponsorship system, and other related issues. But in terms of policy matters, India has taken up these issues with the Gulf countries, intermittently. Whenever something happens, at the diplomatic level, as far as I know, these issues are raised. There have been, discussions regarding managing the recruitment process, managing the process of managing the agents who actually send the migrants to these countries, and how that can actually prevent any kind of exploitative, situation which the migrant or expatriate find themselves in sometimes in the Gulf countries. But it is not something which has very prominently featured in India's, policies towards these countries, and not with UAE, not with Qatar, not with any other country in the region. And I think that is something which might become a bigger issue if these issues keep on kind of coming up in this region. But we have also seen that, for example, in the case of Qatar, especially after the boycott of Qatar, economic and diplomatic boycott, that there has been some movement and also criticism because Qatar is hosting the 2022 FIFA, and how there have been a lot of instances of people being exploited and working in such deplorable conditions in Qatar. So Qatar has also tried to kind of respond to those criticism by tweaking some of its regulations in terms of issues related to migrants. So I think it's something which is a work in progress, and it will depend on a lot of other factors in terms of how it features in India's foreign policy. But at this stage, it's very difficult to put it as something which is very prominent as far as India's policies goes.
Thank you, Muddassir. That's a really fascinating point, and you preempted what was going to be my next question, which was a point raised by both Jasmine Ghani and also Simon Mabon about this issue of sort of domestic. Migrant workers from India working in the UAE or in the Gulf more broadly. And the conditions and whether or not that that human rights situation affects India's position. It's really great that you comment on that. I'd quite like to ask both Sumitha sort of her perspective on that. I'd also wonder, just sort of like to sort of bring in the other panelists as well, just to sort of bring in Guy on this as well, because there is an interesting contrast as I see it. There's a large number of Chinese workers in the Gulf, and my understanding, and it's much more limited than any of you, is that China seems to make a much bigger deal about conditions for its citizens abroad, and it does seem to make that a strong component of its foreign policy in a way that perhaps you're suggesting, Muddassir, India doesn't make it a contingent factor. But I might not be as familiar with that as others. So I very much welcome sort of Guy as well as Sumitha's viewpoint on that. Sumitha, you had your hand up, so do you want to just jump in on that point first of all?
I did. 2 points which actually Muddassir raised, because I did sort of look at the other questions. Following on the migrant and labor issues, I think Muddassir pretty much touched upon that. Despite all the strategic improvements that you see, it is still it is relatively improved. In fact, if you look at the UAE as sort of championing that reformation and how it deals with these issues, organizing the labor market with these databases. It's a lot more structured employment, sort of trying at their end to minimize exploitation with these middlemen. India was pretty weak at that front to the exploitation of workers, both at home and then reaching, the Gulf and finding themselves in pitiable conditions there as well, whether domestic workers or migrant labor, blue-collar workers. So you've seen some improvement since the 2000s. But I think what's changed in the Indian situation also is there's increasing pressure from states within India that have, particularly there's one state, Kerala, which really supplies a whole majority of this labor. And I think these pressure points and repeatedly with states getting under the Modi administration, particularly, there's been a lot of decentralization in how these states can conduct foreign policy. And with that happening, for instance, Kerala is able to constantly hark about certain situations that its people are in and get the Indian government to react to the center. So it's still a feedback sort of loop that goes on. It's still reactive. The center, and as you've come across, even in Guy mentioned, India is a bandwidth. And even Muddassir said, it's security threats, what it's immediately concerned with. It's not really, even though there's all this of its own citizens in the region, not exactly able to do a stellar job on that as yet. But there have been some significant small steps, both on the Indian diplomatic side in these states, in the Gulf states, as well as by the Gulf states themselves. And the UAE would stand out as doing a lot more than, let's say, Qatar, which is still reviewing its kafala system, or the Saudis, etc. Just that quick bit on states in India and their role and sort of pushing this issue of migrant exploitation. And second, just on domestic issues, especially with the Kashmir in August, the movements in Kashmir that New Delhi made, etc. And just how the OIC is the one body that has tried to make some noise about it in the Gulf state and held emergency meetings. The first one didn't. The second one was held about 10 days ago in the midst of when India is going through the China crisis, but you still had the Saudi foreign minister having a call with the Indian foreign minister and sort of updating him after it. So you can see that, and it's not exactly the Saudi or the Emiratis are proposing these motions. It's sort of, Kuwait, interestingly, that's doing it. Of course, Pakistan backing it, but you have the UAE strongly lobbying in favor. The UAE also ensured that the late Sushma Swaraj, the former Indian External Affairs Minister, gave pretty much presented the keynote speech at the OIC, which was a first for India. And second, interestingly, in the most recent round on Kashmir, you have the Maldives and the UAE questioning as to why Kashmir needed to be discussed at all. So you see these sort of small it's hard to tell that they actually discuss it and then present their points, or they just happen. But India's friends in these circles are sort of promoting its cause, even in these situations of whether it's domestic policies shifts. And if I could just, I think then address, looking at the two questions, I think Simon's on material and ideational drivers, which it's a huge question in the sense of the components that will come in. But just quickly, I think, as I said, I think there's been a shift, when you look at the 70s, because 72 UAE gets forms itself from the crucial states, and then you have the labor pouring in from India, and so it's essentially like a labor market relationship that's going on at this point. And small states in India is also weak, and they're trying to fight this big power, like influence the great game that's on, etc. And in that mode, but you sort of see with the oil power coming in, the UAE sort of takes off on a different economic trajectory, whereas India constantly finds itself still in the economic doldrums, which today is also, if you look at another component of this relationship, that is energy, from the 70s crisis to 91, when India faces a balance of payments crisis and liberalizes the economy, and then to like 2020, when the oil prices collapsed to an extent where it's a consumer market, and it's this, I think all of these elements in the material sort of sense also impact how this relationship has gone forward. Again, on the material, talking about economic power, I think, as I mentioned earlier, this shift in how the Saudis and the Emiratis viewed India has a lot to do with, I think, the BRICS idea sort of coming around the same time. Jim O'Neill's report, this whole economic transformation and potential that these countries have. And I think that did have an impact on how the Middle East, the Gulf states, viewed India in particular. And then you sort of see this economic power sort of translating into a flexible political strategic dialogue where, the Gulf countries are really appreciating India's flexibility as well. And how, because interestingly, and I didn't get addressed in the presentation because there was just so much, when you talk about how both India and the UAE can sell their different, sell their own joint statements to their domestic audiences. In every joint statement since the Modi government has come in, they both talk about state-sponsored terrorism without ever mentioning which state they're talking about. But the UAE is talking about Iran, India is talking about Pakistan. So it's really fascinating how the semantics and language and how these statements are crafted show this flexibility. And so it's on the material front. I think ideationally, yes, there's non-alignment since India's independence. Nehru's non-alignment, which Muddassir sort of crafts out in his historical overview as well. But it was non-alignment where you had a friendship treaty with Russia in 71. So whenever India did face a sort of a questioning scenario, it did align with who was its friend at that point. In this, if you look at, let's say the Israel-Palestine support case, for a long time, there's this overarching rhetoric of, supporting the Palestinians, but, military cooperation with the Israelis begins pretty much in the 60s. So you're waiting for, I think India's been waiting for the region, the Middle East, especially the Arab-Israeli dynamic, to relax a bit before bringing out its so-called often used term is bringing it out of the closet, the India-Israel relationship, which it does from the 90s, and more so with Modi coming in. Because by then, I think, and I'm thinking in this forum, everyone will agree that the Saudi, that at least the UAE-Israel dynamic has relaxed, and the Saudis, especially with Mohammed bin Salman's statements once he comes in, indicates that the Palestinian issue is gone down that list of priorities, or in rhetoric at least. So I think with the direct flight from New Delhi to Israel happening through Saudi airspace, there's just so much of these elements that brings me to this whole idea of, is alignment difficult? No, I think India would rather say it's worked out really well for it so far. It's worked out so far. In the sense of, it does present trade-offs and choices that India has to make, but at some point or the other, India has had to assess it and realize that perhaps something else, for instance, in the case of Iran, which is something I've studied, especially with the US, India, and Iran factor in that relationship. India knows it needs, it wants to align more and work strategically and grow that partnership with the US. Would that mean going zero because Trump says go zero on oils, on oil import? Yes. I mean, that's what India does. And India actually, if you notice its pattern, starts doing it way up when it realizes Trump is elected. It starts withdrawing and reducing its supply, what it takes in from Iran. So it's the Modi government has been pretty pragmatic in deciding as to what it wants. Is there a disappointment? Yes, in Delhi strategic circles. I mean, people who work on the relationship are disappointed, but when it comes to just strategic thinking and how you prioritize these partnerships you have and what you want working for you in the long term, India has been pretty all right, even in the case of Iran, letting that happen. So I'll just pause there. Sorry.
Great, Sumitha. That's fantastic. Really sort of detailed and fascinating response. I want to just bring Guy in on 2 points, if that's okay. One, just on that point about China and its relationship, sort of to its citizens living in the Gulf and the region. Just to sort of round off that broader point, given we heard a lot about sort of India, how that might or might not affect India's engagement with the region. But also, whilst you're speaking, Guy, I'd also like you to just if you're willing to tackle some related questions from Francesco Belcastro and Simon Mabon that came up. On going back to your point about rising powers, which I think sort of neatly speaks to all three presentations as well. Francesco asks whether or not will we reach a point where the definition of rising powers doesn't actually apply anymore, or it isn't useful anymore. What does your analysis of these set of relations tell us in terms of sort of, a transition to this, I suppose, at which point are the powers risen, I guess, is the bigger question. And Simon says, related to that, is there still a value in using middle powers or not? Is there something that we should utilize, which does tie in with the UAE point? And then related to that, Simon also asks you, Guy, about how you would differentiate these rising powers. Is there sort of, I mean, he uses the term yeast, but he says that, if you have different types of yeast in the power politics, whether it's material, ideational, soft, or smart power, and so on, could you elaborate more on the differentiation between the three? And perhaps after Guy, you've talked about that. If Muddassir or Sumitha want to sort of jump in with their particular reflections on India's yeast, and also whether or not sort of at which point is India risen on this broader point, and that would be great. So over to you, Guy.
Thanks, Chris. I thought I saw Simon's and Francesco's questions, so I thought I'd answered them. But just to recap, because I think you did take in a slightly different direction, which is is there a point at which rising powers are done, right? I mean, and this is because I guess this term of rising powers has been very much is associated with the context in which we live, which is that we are moving into a multipolar world. We're not there yet. What would sort of the final destination, the final, the end journey end point of a new world order look like? And if that happens, then does that mean rising powers is redundant? I don't know, because I'm not sure that's necessarily the case, because powers are constantly on the they're in flux, they're rising, they're declining. Even if we had a fixed system like that of the Cold War, you would find this variation, this ebbing and flowing going back and forth. So there'll always be sort of powers on the rise and powers on the retreat. And I think this is why it's important to sort of distinguish between sort of the objective ways that we measure power as opposed to the subjective ways. And I think that also it has its impact and influence in terms of the actual actions that powers can take, so their agency. But I also think it's worth keeping in mind the structural constraints that they work within. So, and it's not simply just the international system itself, the state system, but also the sort of the spaces for them to be able to make any influence. So one of the things I didn't mention to Fatima, but yes, we talked about Brazil as sort of on the decline, but something that's similar between both Brazil and India is the structural constraints of not being permanent members of the Security Council. So when you are a permanent member of the Security Council, you have a vote that matters, right? You have an obligation to, whether you want to or not, you have to make a position, you have to stake out a position, even if your position is abstention, right? Whereas, you know, India and Brazil, especially after they left the Security Council post 2012, they were in the luxurious position of not having to take a position or not be totally explicit about their position. And I hope that helps. Just to sort of say, you know, just to sort of, you know, sort of square, you know, sort of, you know, complete the circle in terms of sort of the Chinese and their presence, at least their, you know, sort of their populations. Yes, you point out that Dubai is, you know, the largest Chinese community, you know, within sort of that part of the Middle East. There is a large one as well in Algeria. But Dubai, it's grown significantly. And I think sort of what's interesting there is you've got, you know, a mix of both, you know, sort of ethnically Han sort of majority Chinese population living there, as well as Hui Chinese, who are sort of those of the ethnic minority population. And what's been interesting is there's been sort of outreach done by the Chinese to sort of, you know, bring these people into sort of, you know, the Chinese dream, into sort of the project, the national project that Xi Jinping has been pushing, you know, as in terms of sort of China as becoming a more assertive power. And I think there's a really good, if people are interested, there's a really good report that Yuting Wang of you know, Sharjah University has published with the LSE Middle East Center, which is now out, in which she actually looks in a little bit more detail at, you know, what has been the relationship between, you know, the Chinese state and these and its citizens that are living in Dubai today.
That's great, Guy. Thank you. Muddassir, I don't know if you want to sort of comment on the value of the rising powers in the Indian context. Please take it away.
Yeah, I thought I'll, you know, since we are discussing the issue regarding rising power, I think, I mean, yeah, I mean, before coming to the Indian context, let me kind of reflect a little bit, even though this is not an area which I've walked on much. But, you know, I mean, trying to define rising power or giving a specific kind of a, you know, a name to a country in this kind of a currently fluid global affairs. I mean, we are at a stage where it is very difficult to actually define a rising power, a global power, or emerging power. It's because the situation is in flux. And I mean, for example, I mean, what would one say about UAE? Whether is it a small power, is a rising power, whether it's a dominant power in the Gulf? It is actually, you know, playing a much larger role than much of its larger neighbor. So, or for example, let us take the example of Turkey, whether it is a Mediterranean power or it is, you know, it wants to play a larger role in the, you know, be defined as a middle power. But can we really kind of look at Turkey as, right, also as a rising power, or it's just a regional power? Or specifically coming to Indian context, I mean, India in South Asia cannot be called as a rising power. I mean, it's a well-established, huge, big power. But India in the entirety of Asia, compared to China, it is nowhere. It doesn't. I mean, except for the fact that you need to draw parallels, and you know, there has been a lot of debates when it comes to, for example, Southeast Asia. It's only now that India is trying to engage a little bit more with the Southeast Asian countries. It doesn't really want to poke China, for example, in South China Sea or in anywhere else. So it is very difficult, I would say, or for example, in the larger global affairs, the way India behaves when it is part of the UN temporary member of the UNSC, and the way it reacts once it is no longer, and again in the next, there has been elected to become part of the temporary member of the UNSC. It is different. One can see that depending on the situation, India also positions itself in where its interest lies, where perhaps it will benefit more. And I think this is something which is true for most of the major countries in the world, or even smaller countries. So everyone, depending on their situation, they try to position themselves differently. Most of them are very pragmatic in terms of whom they align with, how do they deal with different countries. So that is something which in my understanding is very important when we discuss about the whole issue of, you know, rising power. It's very difficult to actually define in the current situation. Again, giving for example, when we were talking about the issue of Iran, a US factor in India-Iran relations, but despite of all the coming to India's engagement with the Gulf countries, despite of all the problems, India kind of reduced its oil imports from Iran. But when it comes to Chabahar, it talked to there were diplomatic parleys with the United States, with Washington, trying to say that why not leave this aside, because this is a vital interest. This is not only for us; it's something related to Afghanistan. For you also, it is important. And one sees that some kind of even though there is no formal, there were some issues, statements regarding, some of the companies involved, but there is a working arrangement that, okay, let's continue, you can continue on Chabahar, but other things you have to. And when it comes to India, it's not only the US factor, India-Iran I'm talking about, it's not only the US factor. I mean, there is also factors, for example, India's growing relations with the UAE or Saudi Arabia, who do not really see Iran as a country which is not, I mean, they see Iran as a problem, as somebody who creates problems in the region. As a, for them, Iran is a barrier state. Or, for example, when it comes to Israel also, that doesn't really see Iran as a kind of the way India looks at Iran. So there are, these other considerations as well when it comes to India's, how India looks at the Gulf countries. And then there are, for example, if you look at the issue regarding how Israel-Palestine issue, I mean, despite of all the way India's relations with Israel has evolved, and now it has come out of the whole discussion about coming out of the closet, or the rise of Hindu nationalism and how that kind of is parallel with the Zionist ideas and all that, BJP, Likud, understanding and things like that. But if you look at it, all the debates apart, India has tried to kind of balance when it comes to engagement. So India has continued its in terms of its developmental aid to the Palestinian Authority. There has been a number of political visits, and after going to Israel, after coming back, Modi again went to Ramallah as well. So this was also, when it comes to Palestinian territory as well, this was the first time an Indian Prime Minister went to Palestine. This was trying to balance, both the things. So that trying to balance relations in the region has been continuing as far as India is concerned. Then there was a very good question by Simon on the issue regarding how does Gulf countries look at the rise of Hindu nationalism in India. If I can draw some parallel, the way China has treated its minority population in the Xinjiang region, and most of the countries in the Gulf, or except maybe even Turkey, which, or for example Iran, even Turkey, which in the past used to say a lot, talk a lot about the rights of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang, and has a small diaspora living in Turkey from the Xinjiang region. It has also kind of moderated its statements on criticizing China. Similarly, for example, Iran doesn't really raise these issues in any of the international forums, or the same is true for Gulf countries. So when it comes to interests, when it comes to economic interest specifically, we have seen that Gulf countries have not really been very vocal about issues which are related to internal damage. And I think that is, despite some of the discussions in the social media and all that, in terms of diplomatic and political engagement, I don't really see this, at least for now, becoming an issue, a major issue. And then Indian case is also slightly different, because when it comes to the democratic institutions in India, apart from the fact that there are serious questions about how things might pan out or how things have deteriorated in the last 5 years, at least it's a functional system where elections and political process are largely transparent. There has been a process going on, and this rise of internationalism can also be a kind of check when it comes to the democratic process within India, or at least there are certain checks and balances as far as the domestic political issues are concerned. So I think I'll put that in perspective before actually, coming to the another point regarding the the issue related to the migrants. Again, there was a question, and as we discussed before, uh, I mean, let me put it a little differently. When it comes to the Indian migrants in the Gulf, what if they have to come back? I mean, for India, it would be a huge problem. The number of the rate of unemployment within India at this stage, or even before COVID, is huge. There is a lot of in terms of poverty. Why do actually people go and to not just to Gulf countries, but obviously other parts of the world as well, because they are looking for finding livelihood. And when you talk to these migrants, they would say that, okay, we can perhaps accommodate some of the hardships, but actually it's much better because it's a much better paying job for me. And if you look at the treatment of migrants, I mean, migrants within India, so those who migrate within India from one place to another, that also is not really, India doesn't really have a very great track record of that. So on what basis do you actually raise these questions to another country while your own, I mean, we have looked at how after the lockdown and, March onwards, late March onwards, the kind of problems India faced in terms of the migrants stuck in bigger cities trying to go back to their villages and small towns. So these are the things which
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm genuinely really enjoying this. I'm a little bit conscious of time, and I want to bring Sumitha in.
Yeah, please. So that is something which
I could quite happily listen to you all day. Quite frankly, it's really fascinating, especially the interesting dynamics of Indian politics. But I do just want to bring that just again to complete the discussion of rising and risen powers. If that's okay, Sumitha, if you want to just come in on that point. Thanks, Muddassir.
Yes, so first just about 3-4 things here, but on the rising power, again, I'm not really a purist or engaged too much, but from just the understanding is in rising power in the literature, in IR literature, is it still a useful definition? I think that should be the question, right? If it still is, and there's this growing body of work on how rising powers, whether it's status, like Guy mentioned, TV Paul's work, Rajesh Basru and Kate Estrada on India more particularly. I was just looking at Sandra Destradi's sort of piece also on rising powers and this bibliography that she worked on. So it's this growing body of work. Now, if the definition is really turning, I do believe it's still a useful definition, right, for these countries. And if theorists seem to find that zone, there's a play there, so be it. I wouldn't go ahead to challenge it. So maybe the term middle power, I think, though, comes along in terms of maybe economic strength and where you position these countries. Because India is a middle power, Australia is a middle power, South Korea is a middle power. I mean, these are middle powers, but coming from the Indian circle, you would not really use the term middle power with India with frequency at all as an analyst. It's very rarely used, in fact, which then brings me to this second point, interesting on how these countries that you talk about in these terms react to these terms, right? As soon as the Modi government comes in, there was a new term coined by the External Affairs Minister, through the External Affairs Minister, speeches, etc., which is leading power. And that had, those analyzing Indian foreign policy and strategy, trying to scramble and figure out what that vision meant, what is new about it, and how it's evolving now in the second, now the second term. And so clearly India was sort of reacting to the fact that maybe was a little unhappy with just being clubbed as a rising power. And is China happy today to be a rising power anymore? Or does it actually see itself as a great power? So I think there's the loaded terms that these become, for these countries, for these states, and then, the literature in which we use these terms, which seems pretty, okay, emerging power, rising power, seems to still make sense as these powers who may who are trying to find their place in the international order as they grow, maybe not necessarily even challenging it, though many are seen as challenging it, maybe not as drastically, but sort of accommodating and adjusting to existing institutions and organizations. So that's just, I think, on the term itself. Could I just, could I talk on some of these other points?
We've got about sort of 3 more minutes to meet, so if you want to, I'll let you be the last speaker if the other panelists don't mind that, and please do comment on further points if you.
So second, just it was interesting because Muddassir talked about Chabahar, right? I mean, the fact that this little port in the southeastern Iran is sort of left untouched in a sense. I mean, India finally got like original insurance late last year, and then of course you had Soleimani's killing, and the whole region becoming stressed again. So it's sort of, whenever India actually makes a step forward, it sort of gets bumped back a couple more steps. And when these discussions, when Trump comes in and the JCPOAs, and the U.S. exits, violates the JCPOA, and then you have this question of oil imports decreasing, and then when Mattis visits India to sort of discuss this, I mean, the idea from the statement, the joint statement they make to the press, is essentially that India has ensured if Chabahar is left untouched and India can work on that, there's a waiver given by the US, then essentially you see India sort of tightening its response or its interactions with North Korea, because it sort of had I wouldn't say an extensive, but it certainly had relations going on there. And so that, I mean, India cuts back on that, because at that point, that's what the Trump administration is really, pinpointed, like focused on. So, trade-offs, it's interesting. Third, just going to Jasmine's question, India and China, and how this, it's more to do with, I don't think the Gulf states, and I'll stick to them and not the extended Middle East region, they're not at that point yet where they're even thinking about this dynamic. What they're thinking about is the larger US-China rivalry, and how that is clearly having an impact, and there's a lot being written about that. I don't think India has featured in these calculations yet, and as I mentioned, this is a challenge, a structural constraint that India would find even in dealing with the UAE in certain aspects, because you don't see China the same way as yet, given how China behaves in the Middle East is not how it's behaving in Southeast Asia, and of course not in South Asia as well. And I just think a final, yes, on just a bit on UAE or reactions to anti-Muslim, this rising Hindu nationalism, anti-Muslim violence, etc. So you don't see much coming out until you have the COVID crisis, and a particular, Tablighi Jamaat, this particular group being targeted, and it just goes a bit ballistic on social media with the backlash against Muslims and hashtags and all of that. And then you interestingly have this voice, another social media account, Princess Al-Qasimi, who starts tweeting about it and really going loud about it. And if you sort of, my understanding, it was interesting because you don't have these voices coming from the UAE unless you have a sort of space for it, or given a space for it. So I think it was, though it was, someone just saw a social commentator, just someone who was just talking about, brotherhood and, Hindu-Muslim unity and those kind of lighter terms, but having that and the whole Indian media reaction to it, then spurring a diplomatic reaction with Indian embassies and diplomats and the ministers on the phones with these different Gulf states, sort of trying to calm things down, I think was not really expected, but that's how the particular crisis, that instance evolved, which was interesting to me, that so far before that, the Kashmir or the Citizenship Act did not elicit that sort of a response. So I kind of stop there.
That's great, Sumitha. Thanks so much. I would quite happily sort of let this discussion continue further, but I am conscious we're on a bit of a tight time schedule, so I'm going to wrap things up there. I was just thinking as you were just talking there that given the sort of the various debates that we have within IR, especially at the moment, it really just struck me how loaded this term rising and middle power is, how West-centric it is. And in many ways, what we're actually talking about isn't rising and middle powers, or actually, if we reframe it, we're talking about declining powers. We're talking about the declining Western states that used to exert this huge influence globally and specifically in the Middle East, and have less influence than they did in the past. And instead of just stating things, in terms of declining powers, we instead reframe it as the rising powers from other parts of the world. And that in itself is a very West-centric, Eurocentric sort of way of framing IR, and perhaps we might want to think about that a little bit. I really want to thank all three panelists, Sumitha, Kutty, Guy Burton, Muddassir Quamar, who gave three absolutely fantastic presentations, not only on what you said, guys, which was really sort of food for thought, but your fantastic PowerPoint slides. Already on Twitter, as you've been talking, people have been commenting on how jealous they are about the quality of your graphics and presentation. So I'd also like to say it really is one of the few positives of lockdown is that we do get to have an event like this where we're bringing in people who are based in Singapore, in India, in Brussels, and South London, all in one space, as well as the various attendees we have from different parts of the world as well, which really means that we can have the kind of scholarly dialogue, the international scholarly dialogue that we often talk about, but so often actually fail to do. So it really is an honor and a privilege to be able to bring everyone together working on such interesting parts of the world to discuss this topic. So I really would like to thank you and thank all the attendees for their questions and engagement. Just a final point in terms of a little bit of housekeeping. We have another panel coming up at 11:15, which is on sectarianism and race in the multipolar Middle East. I urge people to go along to that. And also, just a reminder, at the end of the session today at 6:15, sorry, not 6:30 rather. Simon Mabon will be giving some closing remarks at the end of sort of the e-conference, where hopefully he'll bring together the various themes that we've seen in all of our panels. And again, I would like to urge any attendees or former panelists to come along to that as a kind of final endpoint to what has thus far been a really interesting conference. And this latest panel absolutely didn't disappoint. It really was a great discussion. I've learned a huge amount, and I'd just like to thank all three presenters as well as the attendees once again for their contribution. Thank you very much, guys.